I'll try not to repeat maybe what was already said by Marija in the first talk. She gave a lot of interesting statistics and data. The second, I'll talk about what are the consequences of this new outward migration. But also I'd like to be optimistic and maybe look at also the opportunities, because migration is not just it's not just the bad story. There's some positive elements to it. I'll start with the motivations by talking about, there's a lot of talk about the economic concerns being the main driver or dissatisfaction with political institutions. But let's focus a little bit on the economy. There is some question as to how much that is really a driver. Like if you look at the polls, obviously, the youth all over the region, the polls say they're unsatisfied with jobs, with the economy. But there was a poll done by IRI 2 years ago, International Republican Institute. So, and I found a bit of a paradox throughout the region by looking through the data there, is that, everybody is, there's a huge disproportion between people who are complaining about the economy. But when they're asked, what are the social and economic conditions in their own homes, much less people complain about their own personal economic situation. But when they talk about the situation generally, they express more grievances and more concerns. So there's a bit of a paradox here, which I feel is important to understand. And I think that this migration wave, it has a lot of genuine grievances, genuine concern, genuine frustration, genuine desires for, but I think there is a layer there of this, what I call Balkan fatalism. And I wrote a piece on Balkan Insight on this, on how this Balkan fatalism or fatalism is sort of, risks becoming a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you look at the polls that, even in some countries where, where there's more optimism about the future. For example, in the region, I think in Kosovo and Serbia, there was, are a bit, more optimistic. Even there, the younger people are even more pessimistic than the youth. And I think it has to do a lot with expectation. There's a bit of a ahistoric outlook. And there's a wonderful book by Marija Krstevska and Stephen Holmes, that was written 2 years ago, and they talk about this phenomenon not just being part of the Balkans, but across Eastern Europe, of these, they call it the dictatorship of comparison. So people are not just judging, they might not be that bad economically at home, but they compare that with what they see in the West. So so they have this idea that it's not about what you have, it's about what you can have. So so it's more of that pull factor of wanting to to get to those Western standards fast, rather than being in such a hard and economically deprived context at home. This is also sort of this comparative mindset. This is also closely related to mistrust in political change. So the trust in institutions and in politics is very low. So for a lot of youth, the motivation is do I wait, and do I gamble all of my youth and my life by waiting for that kind of standard to come in the Balkans, or do I just exit? And a lot of people are choosing exit. They don't have the patience, the time to wait. So what they're looking at and they're comparing in the West, not necessarily this new wave of migration. It's not necessarily, basic things like jobs, but more like advanced democracy kind of standards, like healthcare, good urban, planning, environmental standards. So it's no longer just about the economy, but they don't have the patience to wait and risk their lives. I mean, spend their youth and their sort of their best years, but they choose this exit. But even when in cases where there is political optimism, for example, in Kosovo, you have now, with the change in government a year earlier, you have this popular government, this wave of political optimism. Even in the cases of political optimism, the desire for migration does not drop, which suggests that the problem is also structural. It goes just beyond what I said. This mistrust in institutions and politics. It's just that our economies are still so underdeveloped in a lot of cases, and they cannot absorb, especially in Kosovo's case, they cannot absorb the huge amount of youth that come into the labor market. So a part of them has to go. But this is not to minimize the genuine frustrations and concerns that Marija very articulately elaborated of, people not being listened to, institutions not being responsive. I think there's another very important dimension to highlight. It's the pull factor, and I think a lot of European countries have done had a very negative role, particularly countries like Germany, by designing specific programs that are sucking away talent from the region. Specifically targeting skilled workers. And I think by doing that, they are effectively stealing human capital that Balkan countries have built. Our countries have invested a lot of money in educating all these skilled workers and providing healthcare for them, and now just preparing workers for the German labor market. And I think this is an issue that our countries should raise with Germany. I'm not saying they should stop migration, but I think that there needs to be a little bit of consideration of the consequences that this is causing in the region. And I'll stop here and I'll list 3 consequences. First, I think the migration waves, the most recent one, is kind of depleting the countries of exactly the kind of scarce human capacity that we need to develop, to move into higher value-added economic sectors and to deliver better public services. So it's stealing away exactly the kind of workers we need to move into those Western standards. And so we risk not having any more absorption capacity for new investment. Even if investors are coming, they're unable to find the kind of workers they need to come into our region. Secondly, I think there's a very important political consequence of the migration wave. And this has been the case in countries like Poland, Hungary, or even Romania. Migration can deplete these countries, our countries, of voters who are most inclined to support democratic reforms. By getting these more talented, more skilled, more educated, urban voters, and leaving more older generations, more conservative population in their own countries, they also produce more illiberal regimes, more conservative countries. So in a way, it also has a negative impact on democracy, which is also one of the criteria that we need to access or join Western institutions. Thirdly, I think in this context of struggling economies and this context where migration also entrenches authoritarianism, I think this also increases security risks. The Balkans we have a lot of these bilateral and ethnic disputes, and this adds further tension to those disputes by, as I said, by making the countries more authoritarian, less developed.